and blatantly ignores the rules-based order. Let me also take this opportunity to thank Ray Powell, because even if other countries in Southeast Asia would choose to be silent with what they so-called quiet diplomacy in covering up all those aggressive actions and unlawful activities of the People's Republic of China, you can just follow the Twitter account of Ray Powell, and you will see that the Chinese aggression is not just happening within the Philippine waters. Thank you.
Thank you, fantastic, Commodore. Dr. Hu, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. And I think the Rear Admiral Jiang has shared the perspective of Philippines on the incidents happened in the South China Sea. I think China definitely has its own perspective on the same incidents. So I think for the Chinese perspective, it is law enforcement activities. So it is China's claimed waters. So China has the right to patrol and do the law enforcement activities. And also, but today, I don't want to debate with Jiang and not. I just share the information. As far as I know, China's Coast Guard doesn't have so-called laser weapons. So that's totally fake news. So-called laser weapons of the PC of China Coast Guard. My point today is about the maritime domain awareness, the relationship between maritime domain awareness and the relationship between MDA and disinformation. MDA is difficult because human being usually is not living at sea. So, and we are short of sensors and platforms to observe activities, especially man-made activities in the maritime domain. So even capable as the US and China, they couldn't always know what happened at the sea. And also different countries has different perspective and different positions. Even on the same incidents, they have different stories and narrative. So it's because of differences in national interests and stances, information released by each country regarding maritime incidents may be incomplete and biased. Different actors of governments, academia, think tanks, and media play different roles in MDA. So today, we just examine different actors of governments, academia, and media, their limitations and roles in the MDA. Governments possess powerful state apparatus and comprehensive surveillance and investigation capabilities, and can verify the truth and facts through information from different sources. Usually, the information we release was authoritative, albeit one-sided and biased. Different governments typically only publish facts that are favorable to themselves. It is common that they have different interpretations and narratives even on the same incident. So it makes sense Beijing and Manila have different interpretations and narratives on even the same incidents. However, the governments will not release rumors and fake news that are clearly not true out of consideration for national reputation. Governments typically release information with caution. Therefore, I found it very difficult to understand the information released by the Philippine government on many occasions. For instance, in December of 2022, the Philippines accused that China has made the land reclamation at Wilson Reef, and also in the earlier of last year, the Philippine government accused that China made the land reclamation at Sambila shore. You know, land reclamation is a big event. How can China make land reclamation correctly? And the Philippine governments, you have all kinds of forces. You have vessels. You have aircraft. Why not just send them to have a look? So I couldn't understand, actually. The second type of actors, academia and think tanks. Academia usually focus on some specific area. Their strength lies in the in-depth analyzing of some particular issue, but lacks the ability to perceive the whole picture, especially on-site situation information. With the development of big data and artificial intelligence, open source intelligence information has been significant growth. Academia think tanks can access data and information that was previously only available to governments and militaries. Ever since 2019, SSPI has used big data and AI to do some interdisciplinary researches and share the data of military activities and fishing vessels to the world. We will seldom interact with Jane and other colleagues here on X. Well, most of the time, we only publish the facts we have without any comments. This type of work supplements government data and information in related countries to some degree, helping the academic to do the research. Well, I should say, this kind of work cannot represent information released by the government, and the richness and accuracy of open and commercial data cannot be compared with the work of the governments. Anyway, we don't have vessels and aircraft and couldn't do on-site verification. Media plays an important role in dissemination of information and information sharing. There is strength of media outlets and big ways in social media lies in their connection to the grassroots and their ability to influence the public. However, their narrative and reports are often incorrect, exaggerated, and full of speculation. The situation in the South China Sea is tense, but it is nowhere near as extreme as many media outlets have described. And compared with other regions, I think the situation of the South China Sea is not too bad. This kind of shortcoming is determined by the nature of media. Journalists and reporters don't consistently focus on maritime issues such as South China Sea and just follow the hot spot. They can only passively obtain information from the government and academia, and they need to consider the public attention and usually the media like making big news. As to the South China Sea, international media are too focusing on China, while ignoring the operations and actions of the other claimants, states like Philippines and Vietnam. Everything involved China is big news. On the contrary, nothing happened. I have communicated with my media friends on this unbalanced situation, and their answer is very simple and identical, because China is a great power. So in conclusion, I think the cross-validation and on different perspective of information and the balanced narrative are crucial and important for our a current understanding of the situation and countering disinformation in the South China Sea and other maritime domain. Finally, I think the MDA is not just data of the warships and aircrafts, but also the intentions analyzing. I think I have no intention to offend, but I think the current Philippines views on China and China's policy on South China Sea are full of speculation, suspicion, and imagination. So today we are in a world of in an interacted world. Action means reaction. So it is a circle. So that's why I said I have a suggestion to the Philippines yesterday on that. Don't give China chances anymore, because as far as I know, Beijing doesn't have any specific plan in the South China Sea. We are just in the position of response. So if more challenges, more opportunities for Beijing. So Beijing's policy has never been changed. The Jane has shared a lot of incidents happened, but for the China's perspective, we have our saying that we are protect our sovereignty and the maritime rights. So when you are making decision makings in the process of decision makings, you can protect your sovereignty and maritime rights, but you should also consider the reaction and the concern of other side. So SSPI and I would like to give favor to the Philippines. If you like, we can help you to better understand China's position and the policy of the South China Sea. I think we have a better position compared with you to understand China's intentions. Thanks. I should stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Hu. We'll take your advice and shift the attention away from China momentarily and move on to the Malaysian panelist, Dr. Tricia Yeo.
Thank you, Alina, and good morning to everyone. Magandang umaga, kumusta? I am seated in a very awkward position right between the two panelists here, and I think that's that was planned. So thank you to WPS and to friends who have invited me here. I was here in May as well for the dialogue on ASEAN maritime transparency. Firstly, I'd like to just say that I am not a South China Sea expert. So why indeed am I here? I focus more on domestic politics. I used to run a think tank, and I look more at public policy from the domestic lens. However, I think it is very important to include individuals such as myself as we try to build coalitions across Southeast Asia. I think it's important to also invite people who are not narrowly interested in the South China Sea, as these narratives are starting to take bigger ground. Despite the fact that I don't focus on it, it's without a doubt something that comes up time and time again, so it's not something that we can ignore. How I'm going to address my interventions this morning, I have basically 4 sections. The first, I have some preliminary comments. The second is I'm giving you some statistics as someone who's a researcher. Third, I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual topic on disinformation campaigns. And finally, I want to talk about how we build resilience from among communities. So first, some preliminary comments. I've been listening a lot to the panels over the last day. I think first principles first, where everyone in the room should, and this is a prescriptive statement, right? That we should uphold international law, that we should adhere to a rules-based international order. This is something that if all in the room do not subscribe to, then it's very difficult for any other issue to be resolved, South China Sea notwithstanding. However, I think it's also naive of us in the room to speak about the South China Sea because the conversation around this is happening not in isolation. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's happening at a time, especially this year, where we have an escalating trade war. Countries are grappling primarily with trade. ASEAN, as many have noted, is navigating a very narrow space, and increasingly narrow as well, between the powers of the US and China. So I think one of the primary challenges that the Philippines will face, and I do have great sympathies, I mean, watching the videos earlier that Jay has shown, we know that that cannot be fake news because it was actually documented. The challenge, I do think, is to proclaim, or the challenge is for some countries to proclaim and uphold respect for international law, the very same international law that I just mentioned, or international rules-based order, when some countries are not respecting that in other facets of, say, trade, as well as involvement in the Middle East, in Gaza. Maybe I'm representing a view from a country in Southeast Asia that has these perceptions. So the effect of this, what is the effect? The effect is that international law is perceived to only be respected when and if it is of benefit to the nation. Meaning to say that within some countries in Southeast Asia may question the moral authority of some other nations to speak precisely about rules-based international order. Okay, my second broad point is about statistics. So I just pulled up some interesting reports that one of which was done by Doublethink Lab in Taiwan on the China Index. So this measures the PRC's overall influence. And very interesting, Southeast Asia obviously features very highly in this list. Number 2 on the list is Cambodia. This is just after Pakistan, interestingly. Singapore is actually number 3. Just, shout out to my Singaporean friends down the coast. Number 5 is Thailand. Number 7, Indonesia. Malaysia is 13. Myanmar, 26. Vietnam, 27. And 29th is Philippines. So this measures China's overall influence within these countries, measured by different things. I also pulled out some interesting statistics, and this is where it becomes relevant for South China Sea. So the State of Southeast Asia survey in 2025 that is done by ICES, Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, it shows that 48.2% cited their top concern as China's encroachment in EEZs and continental shelves of Southeast Asia's littoral states. 44.3% of Southeast Asians believe that their top concern is an accidental confrontation between ASEAN member states and China that would result in a political crisis. 69.5% believe that UNCLOS should be upheld and that the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling is important to be upheld. Sorry, just a few more, bear with me. 46.1% believe that ASEAN should support actions that would deter aggressive behavior and participate in joint military exercises. And finally, 29% believe that the Israel-Hamas conflict will result in diminished trust in international law and rules-based order. So there you have it. It aligns with my very first statement about how what happens around the world does impact upon our perceptions of how even the South China Sea conflict is to be dealt with. This is not to say that disinformation campaigns do not exist. This has also been well documented. So Freedom House has done a really good report on Malaysia specifically. Malaysia is also has a very unusual demographic, right? Because we have a very large percentage of our population being of ethnic origin. But then again, you're talking about several generations ago. So whether or not this Chinese population continues to be influenced is a matter of research. But we do know that there is infiltration, for example, from among our Chinese-based media within Malaysia, and there are many of those outlets. So a lot of Chinese news reports from China, like Xinhua and so on, will be repeated, will be re-reported within our Chinese local newspapers and radio stations. So what you actually have is like a parallel paths where different communities within Malaysia are also exposed to different kinds of news, depending on what language it is that they read in. So this Freedom House report looked at the countries in Southeast Asia that had high media influence, and that would be Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines, high media influence of the PRC, that is. And it also looked at resilience and response. So while Indonesia and the Philippines have high resilience and response, meaning that their communities can maybe decipher what kind of disinformation they're receiving, countries like Malaysia, unfortunately, only have a notable resilience and response, meaning to say that we actually don't have those inbuilt resilience mechanisms. So I think my final point is, this fourth and final point, is about building resilience to disinformation. And I also like to make the point that it's not just disinformation from one country, right? There's all kinds of disinformation that takes place in our world today, and not to mention the advance of generative artificial intelligence. So how do we build resilience among our communities of all sorts of disinformation? We need to be all-encompassing by including the media. And this is where I do believe in transparency. I like transparency initiatives. In fact, the think tank that I used to lead, Ideas in Malaysia, we've cooperated with Stratbase here in the Philippines, as well as other think tanks around the region, to do a transparency initiative of infrastructure projects, specifically for the BRI. And interestingly, this methodology has now been adopted in other regions around the world. So the Latin America and other countries are taking up this BRI monitor methodology. So investigative journalism, I think, is absolutely crucial. We also need to look at government, what governments are doing to help stop state-based disinformation campaigns. Civil society and donors around the room, really important. Think tanks, we need to build allies, and I'm glad to be here because I think a lot more of this needs to happen. The Philippines cannot just operate on a track 1, 1.5, or even 2. I mean, it needs to go beyond that, building coalitions to understand what your concerns are. Sometimes we are very far away. Our concerns are maybe looking more at Myanmar, what's happening on the other side of Southeast Asia. The tech companies need to bear responsibility as well. And finally, I think cooperative projects across think tanks would be really ideal. The BRI monitor that I mentioned is also interesting. It doesn't necessarily attack BRI projects in China because we're trying to move beyond that. So I think I'll just end with that final point that any initiative, transparency or otherwise, I would love to see it done in a more research-oriented manner. And I given the perspectives I've heard from our Chinese colleagues over the last day and a half, I do think that the intention needs to be that it's all-encompassing rather than, say, a research project that is directly targeted at China alone. I think this is how you build coalitions, this is how you build goodwill, and build allies across the oceans, across nations within Southeast Asia. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Tricia. Thanks for broadening the context and knitting the different points about investigative journalism, but also different disinformation campaigns, as well as the broader geopolitical picture. So, Dr. Marika Olberg, over to you, please.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me here to speak to you today. I'm not an expert on the South China Sea, but I do spend about what sometimes feels like 90% of my time running around Europe, trying to explain to different stakeholders how China approaches information spaces and what that means for our responses to some of the manipulation of the information spaces that we are seeing. So this is really what I want to focus on here today, and just lay down some basic principles that I think are essential to understand what is happening and what that means for our response. So first point first, I'm not going to be talking about China. You will hear me repeat one acronym quite frequently throughout my intervention, and that is CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, which is the main actor that is relevant and whose methods, approaches really shape how this response takes place. So I prefer not to talk about, Chinese disinformation, et cetera, but rather name the actor quite specifically. One of the ways that I like to explain how the CCP deals with information spaces is it takes a united front approach to how to manage information spaces. What does that mean? United front is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and I'm sure Professor Brady will also chip in on that, who has done a lot of the groundbreaking research on this topic. But the basic idea here is that you're going to approach it in a way that divides between friends and enemies and tries to build the broadest possible coalition against your principal enemy or principal adversary. That is something that is also applied in information spaces. What does this look like in practice? On the one hand, it means that for getting across points, you're not just going to obviously use your own channels, but you're going to do the broadest possible networking and work with local proxies on the ground. That can be people that are won over for opportunistic means, it can be monetary means, it can be other reasons why somebody would want to convey official CCP talking points. There's a number of motivations there, but the idea behind that is it also makes it harder to counter, because if you are trying to counter it, you're not going against what a foreign government is saying, but essentially you're up against your own civil society that repeats a lot of the official Chinese talking points. It also means that there is an approach to try, even where there is not the broadest possible support for the official CCP position, it tries to create the impression of the broadest possible support. Official Chinese government sources and CCP sources have started in the past couple of years to speak on behalf of the international community, saying the international community disapproves of this and that. The entire international community all agrees that, X, Y, Z. And that's just a talking point that has been appropriated. It also means that a lot of in social media, the CCP works with a lot of coordinated inauthentic behavior. I have done quite a bit of research on this, tracking actual networks and tracking some of the government and party bodies that set up those networks. I'm happy to go into some more detail on this if there is time. But the basic idea is if enough people, or people that are thought of as real on social media, keep repeating the official talking points often enough, they will be accepted in the end and they will become true. This also means that those who are seen as adversaries are basically being flooded with those talking points, and the idea is to wear people down in the long run and overwhelm them. Now, who would be considered an adversary or an enemy? On the global level, that would be the United States. In different local contexts, other people and other groups and other countries can get picked out to get what I call the enemy treatment, where people are being treated in ways that are meant to overwhelm them and to build a coalition against them, to deplatform them, to silence them, to isolate them. This is something that quite a few people have experienced. This is often done in ways that include what I would call a strategic overreaction. Where you have, for the longest time, the conversation is all peaceful and friendly, and then you have a strategic overreaction where there is a lot of pushback against a person, a group, a certain talking point, and the idea, again, is to overwhelm, to deplatform, to isolate, and to get people to shut up. This is seen in the information space, but it's also seen in various other spheres. It can be seen in campaigns against individual countries. We've seen Lithuania on the end of this. Australia has quite a bit of experience with this. There's a number of other countries that have been subjected to this kind of enemy treatment. And one of the things that I want to emphasize there, because people often ask me, well, is what the CCP or what China is doing, is it really effective? Because you often have statements or individual information campaigns that are clumsy. And the way that I talk about this is you might have individual campaigns or individual talking points or individual interventions that fail, but as a package, this approach to information spaces and to managing international relations and to managing different groups of people works quite well. Because you have a situation where things are peaceful and harmonious and everybody gets along quite well for the longest time, and then you suddenly have a strategic overreaction and everybody gets scared. And everybody is afraid of getting that same treatment, and people will then act accordingly and think to themselves, better not offend China and better make sure that I stay on China's good side. So because of this approach of trying to build the broadest possible coalition and isolating individual countries, individual groups, this means for our response, it really needs to be the broadest based, most collective, and also, frankly, on some of the basic facts, outspoken. Because the basic idea is, otherwise, if you don't act collectively, you will just have those countries, often this is the Philippines, in other contexts, it's other countries, who will stand out and will then receive a response that is a strategic overreaction and will be overwhelmed by that. And really the only way to counter that is collectively. So to end on that, I think initiatives such as the Transparency Initiative are good in countering some of when there is misinformation. And I think this is already being attempted, it really needs to be in the broadest possible coalition, drawing in more and more countries in order to be the most effective. What I usually tell people in Europe is you shouldn't just look to your traditional allies, you should also look to other countries around the world to see how you can build a broader coalition to counter some basic information manipulation or other factors that you deal with when you're dealing with the Chinese government or the CCP. I will end here and look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Olberg. We're certainly seeing in other parts of the world how if you repeat talking points often enough, they eventually become socialized into truths. Pass the mic over to Professor Anne-Marie Brady. Jay, do you happen to have the clicker for the PowerPoints? Thank you.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Warm Pacific greetings, everyone. It's a great honour to be here. So I'm going to flick through some slides to give you some background to the themes that I want to talk about. But first of all, I want to highlight the interconnectedness between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific theatres. We're seeing China backing up Russia in the illegal invasion of Ukraine. We are seeing Russia and China cooperating in the Indo-Pacific, and the South China Sea is one small part of a very conflicted, challenging environment in the Indo-Pacific. Russia has its own interests there, but we're seeing it partnering with China, particularly on disinformation. And so I want to just run through these slides and I'll talk some more about the role of disinformation in the strategic environment in the Indo-Pacific. In Europe, it's a hot war. In the Indo-Pacific, it's hybrid warfare. And a particular tool of China's hybrid warfare approach is foreign interference. And in Chinese terms, that's 国际统战, international united front work, and it's been very neglected in our field of Chinese politics, but certainly in the Cold War it was well understood the role of international united front work as well as its domestic variant. And United Front work is the CCP or any Marxist-Leninist party's basic strategic mindset. If you want to know how China is going to behave, you have to think about, from a United Front point of view, who is the chief enemy. In World War II, of course, it was Japan. In the current era, it's the United States for international United Front work. And then in Chinese CCP terms, Taiwan is also a key target for domestic United Front work. The goal of United Front work is to divide the partners of the chief enemy away from each other, and China forms temporary alliances, engages in United Front work, foreign interference to achieve that. So first, let me highlight some maps. We're used to seeing in the southern Pacific, we're used to seeing a Pacific order. Those of you of the northern hemisphere are used to seeing an Atlantic-centered order. Here's another order, a China-centered world. This is an official map of China. The international headlines when it was released were all about the other map in the package, which was the first ever map of China to show the 9-dash line around the South China Sea, claiming that China controls the whole of the South China Sea. But this map was more significant. China would like to push the US out of East Asia, and they're particularly focused on what we have heard of the island chains concept and the hub and spoke series defense arrangements that were set up after World War II, initially for fear of the rise of Japan, but soon after because of China, the People's Republic of China, and the Soviet Union, to keep the Soviet Union out of the Pacific and then also to contain China. So China's reacted against that. Briefly, here are some of the thinking behind China's strategic ideas. I'm not going to go into that. Halford Mackinder, concept of the heartland, as I said, the ideas of the hub and spoke and the containment strategies of Atchison and Dulles, a fear of choke points, and now the new era that we're in. The Belt and Road is China's new order. China's going to look for where it can take benefits out of the existing international order. The veto at the United Nations Security Council is appreciated. Having the China-seated international organizations is appreciated. But we're seeing China setting up a parallel order, a China-centered order. Russia and China describe, or Xi Jinping and Putin describe the rules-based international order as a Western order. And they see that now is their time. They think the West is weak and divided. And so China is setting up a parallel order to achieve the change that it wants. So this quote comes from Global Times, Chinese version. It was removed soon after there was international attention on it, but it's a Chinese source. So China's thinking on the Indo-Pacific has some lessons from the Pacific War. As they say, history repeats, but it doesn't rhyme. China wants to learn the successes and failures of Japan as well as the United States. And one of the ways in which the US was able to succeed against Japan was through winning the hearts and minds of people in the Pacific. In our current era, the US was prepared to defend the North Pacific, but it's pretty much leaving the South Pacific to itself. And the South Pacific is crucial for the security of the overall Indo-Pacific. China is looking to set up ports and bases, friendly ports, bases, and airfields across the Pacific, and information bases, intelligence bases across the Pacific. And they're not doing so through measures that we're used to seeing through great powers. They're doing it so through dual use, through Belt and Road Initiative, whereby countries have to take out loans to set up military-grade airports like Faleolo Airport in Apia, or military-grade wharf like Luganville Wharf and Santo Island in Vanuatu, or utilising territory which is World Bank or ADB funding. In the Solomons, China's state-owned enterprises take on the vast majority of all the strategic infrastructure projects in the Solomons for ports and airfields. They have gamed the procurement set up in the World Bank and the ADB. And the means in which China manages to influence and infiltrate our societies, as I said, is foreign interference. And there are 4 key targets or vectors of that. First of all, targeting our political and economic elites. Secondly, targeting our overseas Chinese communities. Even when there are societies when there's only a very small ethnic Chinese population. In Niue, for example, there is only one family, Chinese family, but that family is the key node connecting China's United Front policies to elites in Niue, in the island of Niue. So it doesn't matter how large the population is, China will either send someone to engage in foreign interference or will infiltrate and influence the existing Chinese communities. So our Chinese communities are very vulnerable. So I have been focusing on the Pacific in recent years, but I'm also been looking at what's happening in Southeast Asia. And what I have found is in Southeast Asia that one of the most resilient is perhaps surprisingly Vietnam, because the Vietnamese Communist Party understands United Front work very well, and they themselves employ it. And they have very interesting strategy in dealing with the CCP. They're not like King Canute trying to stop the ocean. They know that the ocean just keeps rolling and rolling. The waves crash on the beach. So they understand you have to be perpetually resilient against CCP foreign interference. And they are very vulnerable. They have a long history of the imperial China occupation and interference in Vietnamese politics. But they have a good way of dealing with CCP foreign interference while protecting the ethnic Chinese community. And Singapore also is very resilient. We have it's very good to see the transformation in Philippine politics and compared to how I think their attitude towards China a few years ago was very concerning. And similarly, Malaysia has made some changes. Cambodia is very influenced by China's foreign interference. So what we see in China's efforts to influence the strategic environment in the Indo-Pacific is targeting our elites, corrupting them, and turning them into assets for China. In the Pacific, Kiribati and Solomons are a very prominent example of this. Utilizing police ties, because the Public Security Bureau of China is an intelligence organization. It's responsible for counterintelligence. And so when we talk about police ties across the Pacific, we're seeing an expansion of intelligence presence in the Pacific. I've just returned from the Solomons. China has about 12 police officers working in the Solomons. They are expanding their activities into every area of society, including trying to introduce a method of policing, extremely authoritarian policing called the Feng Chao model, which can be a risk not only for communities in the Solomons, but potentially is being used to collect data for DNA and other data for much wider uses. And we've seen that with activities that China's engaged with in targeting our universities and accessing strategic information. So China has police ties and police presence in Kiribati, in the Solomons, in Vanuatu. It has police presence in Samoa, although it is more ad hoc, and in Tonga as well. And China has sent large numbers of Pacific journalists up to China for training and offered significant subsidies to Pacific medias who are very vulnerable. Like all medias around the world, funding is a big challenge these days. And China has had an open checkbook in some countries for the media, which other governments just cannot replicate. And it's interesting to see when there is changes in that. The checkbook is not completely open anymore. China doesn't have as much financial resources as it used to. And more we're seeing that China is getting other countries to pay for the cost of propaganda. For example, the Confucius Institutes, which are 50-50 funded, or, as I said, the Belt and Road Initiative strategic infrastructure projects, which are either funded by the host country or through World Bank and ADB loans. So, what to do? Well, I always say what to do: united front against the united front. The Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic security setup is interlinked. We have common interests, and we have to work together across the Pacific, and the South Pacific and the North Pacific, and into Southeast Asia. We have to stand together. And one of the strongest ways that we can work together is through the economy, by free trade agreements, and opening up wherever it's possible. Sometimes an FTA is a bit too hard, but in whatever way we can strengthen each other economically can help countries to withstand the pressure that China puts on individual nations, which is frequently through the economic vector. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brady. Fascinating how different actors learn from their adversaries from past times, or that good old divide and rule adage. This is supposed to be a fireside chat. We haven't had a chat just yet, but certainly a few sparks of that fire have been lit. What I'd like to do is bring you all in. I have a ton of questions and comments myself, but this is not about me, and so I'd like to bring in all of you. I already see hands raised. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to maximize time by taking 3 questions at a time, and I'll try to get as many as possible. Ian, I saw you first. Gentleman in the back with the red tie, you're next. And I'm going to take Lady Nat, I'll save you for the next round. The lady in maroon. Please, Ian.
Okay, here we go. Right, so I agree with Dr. Hubo that governments should be careful in the information that they use. But I also agree with my friend Tricia that sometimes they are not. And I agree with Tricia too that sometimes civil society, academia, media are important in sort of pointing out some of the limitations of what governments do. So I'm actually quite curious as to your own different situations. Jay, I'll leave you out of this because you're wearing a uniform. But for the other 4 panelists, I mean, in your own context, where do you think that in your own government's handling of information, they've got it wrong, or that they've put out information that is untrue? Thanks.
Good morning. Good morning. Okay. I'm Irvin Jules Beltran-Saped, the Executive Director of PhilSea, Philippine International Law of the Sea Academy. So in the name of transparency as policy, my question is about 2 terms that should already be clarified in first and foremost. So Philippines and China, as well as allies and other states, advocate for upholding international law and the rules-based international order. But my question is adhering to rules-based international order also an adherence to international law-based order? If yes, then why do we seldom use the term international law-based order? If no, then what are the elements needed for states like Philippines and China to fully adhere to the universal principles of international law-based order? Thank you.
Thank you. Madam?
Hello. Hi. Good morning, everyone. Absolutely excellent panel to start the day with, I think. I'm Irishika Pankaj. I'm the director of a Delhi-based think tank that focuses on Chinese domestic and party politics. My question starts with a small comment. We do a lot of work in South Asia on public opinion surveys. And just, to briefly mention, we conducted one recently in Nepal. And one of the questions that we had in that was about, to the general Nepali public, which is the international conflict that you have the most amount of public information access to? And almost 41% responded with the answer, the South China Sea. So there's a lot of conversation and focus about what is going on in the South China Sea that is making its way back to South Asia, especially in countries where there is a stronger influence of Chinese, information and hybrid warfare. I guess my question on this note to the panel is, do you see any scope for cross-regional mechanisms developing in the future between Southeast Asia, South Asia, even parts of Europe, where there is a scope for an international mechanism that can work on transparency initiatives, much like the one that Philippines has started, but there are so many more sensitive democracies in South Asia that would benefit from these mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the panel. G, I'm going to give you first right of response if you choose, because you might have to leave earlier.
Well, first of all, I would like to respond to Ian's question, although I'm wearing uniform, because I'm very confident to respond to this, because for the Philippine government, I wouldn't believe that we are publishing untrue statement, or as what Dr. Hu said, fabricated videos to support our claim. We do that because we partner with the media, local and international media. When we first did the transparency effort, it was only the Philippine Coast Guard was documenting all these incidents. And the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, ended up with their own line saying that the Philippines is using propaganda to paint the People's Republic of China negatively to the eyes of the international community. So we made a calibration. We embedded journalists and not just relying on our crew to document all this. And then they, again, came up with another excuse saying that the Philippines is making use of their own nationalist journalists. So we made another calibration. We embedded international media from Japan, Australia, Germany, France, United States, all of those countries who would be willing to document all this. Let me highlight the fact that the Philippines is not an authoritarian state. We are a democratic country. We respect freedom of the press. We respect freedom of expression. And to counter that the Philippines is coming up with those reproduction of those imaginative to paint China as a bad guy, I don't think that is actually the real scenario in the West Philippine Sea. Those media, journalists from from other countries were also having that independent editorial story will be the witnesses to tell who's telling a lie and who's fabricating their own narratives. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hu, would you like to respond?
I want to say something about Yan's question about yes, I think even government, as I have said, they don't always know what happened. So sometimes they do make some mistakes. But I think the government should be very cautious to release the information. So that's my point, is that when you face very clear truths and facts, such as land reclamation at Wilson Reef and Sambila Reef, it's totally wrong. It's very easy to verify whether it is or not. So Jen mentioned the video. Even video have different angles. You have videos, China have videos. So I think for third parties, we need to combine to analyzing based on different statements from related parties and different information released by different parties, then we maybe have a much balanced and accurate analyzing of the situation. To a situation of the rule-based of international water or international law-based of water, yes, in China, we prefer to say international-based of water because rule, what kind of rule? Which rule? The rule is not certain, so we prefer to use the term of international-based of water. But even international law, different countries have different interpretations. So there are some ambiguity. That's true. Thanks.
Tricia?
Sure. Thank you for the questions. I'll attempt to answer them. So the first, so when we think about how governments put out information, and more broadly speaking about the disinformation space, it's actually warfare out there. We know that because of AI and so on. I mean, I think even videos can be doctored, so we as individuals have to be really careful. Do we have the right mechanisms built within us as well, right, to be able to interpret what's true and false? I was just writing down like the different type of actors who are engaged in, say, disinformation. So you have, at the very bottom, you have like influencers, you have tech companies, you have political parties and political individuals. But I think the one that we are concerned with is when it is state-sponsored. So again, transparency initiatives that can very finely distinguish between what is state-sponsored versus what is not. And I also think that that line is becoming very difficult as well because the state may be sponsoring parties or individuals or agents in ways that are not actually transparent or made known to the rest of us. So that's where, again, think tanks and civil society can come in. The biggest fear, though, I think, what we're talking about when we talk about disinformation is when the disinformation campaigns are foreign funded, so foreign state funded, and in combination, foreign state funded in a way that hampers domestic democracy, as has been shown in countries like Romania, where funding from both Russia and China actually undermine their electoral processes. So I think that is the fundamental fear. We're not talking about just all disinformation, but the one that hits the most where it actually hampers democracy and electoral processes. On the question of public opinion surveys in Delhi and India, I absolutely agree that there can be regional mechanisms that can work on transparency across region. And I like the comments that was made that we need to be thinking in a more innovative way. So maybe what you're looking at, and I draw from my own experiences, as I mentioned in my first intervention on transparency of public infrastructure projects of the BRI, which can cut across regions. So it's not just about what's happening in Southeast Asia. You're looking at examples across Africa, across Latin America. Could there be something similar? Of course, the Philippines would not have to, would have to name it something else, right? It's not about South China Sea transparency alone, but transparency on all kinds of infractions and certain violence and aggressive behavior that's not concentrated on one country alone. I think that is how, again, you can build cooperation across different regions, but calling it a different name. Thank you.
Dr. Olbo?
I think I want to make 2 points that are perhaps going to answer some of the questions more or less directly or indirectly. So first, in response to Ian's question, I think what I want to say is not so much how the German government or various European governments handle information, but or put out their own information. I think that's an entirely separate debate. But one point I want to make is where I do think they still sometimes get it wrong is in terms of simply understanding how, and that was the point I was trying to make earlier, how the CCP approaches the information environment. And there are some countries that understand this better. In the Czech Republic, there's been a lot of progress on understanding this, in part thanks to the work of the people that do the research there, but also I do think there is the element of having a little bit of an understanding of how communist parties work themselves, and that has been incredibly helpful. But the basic idea to understand is you are dealing with a situation where the CCP approaches the information environment as one of the fronts, the public opinion front, where for the longest time the idea has been, or the main slogan associated with this is 西强我弱, the West is strong and China is weak on this front. So basically you're approaching this from a perspective where you're challenging information dominance. So the first step that you want to get to is to get to a point where it's a he said, she said, right? The idea is right now, or until recently, I feel like right now the assessment is changing. Western media are dominating the conversation. So we need to get to a point where there is contention and where it's a he said, she said situation. So Philippines says this, China said that. Who knows what's really true, right? Or US says this, China says that, but they're really all biased, etc. So that's already a win if we can get to a he said, she said situation. And then in the next step, of course, you want to have in the next stage, you want to make sure that most of the countries, most of the international public listen to the main output from China. But that's the next step that is kind of a little bit in the future. And I think right now there has been some progress on this front, but already having the he said, she said, and nobody really knows what's happening is a success. And that's why I think that needs to be countered more resolutely, and that's an understanding that I think is still lacking in much of Western Europe for sure, and here in the region possibly as well. In terms of what other initiatives elsewhere, there are not as many, I think, completely comparable initiatives as the ones in the Philippines. But I think what would be, what I have seen in the European context that's useful, and in a Western context that's useful, and that I think is something to consider, since we're also talking responses here, is essentially basic information sharing mechanisms that are set up at the EU level or at the G7 levels. You have information sharing. If a campaign happens, you can exchange information with your allies or with other countries, and you have a way of responding potentially collectively. I'm not saying that this is working perfectly, but it's a first step towards a collective response. And I think if here in the region we get to that point where that is possible, to have this kind of information sharing mechanisms and rapid response mechanisms, that would already be a huge step.
Thank you. Professor Brady? Okay. We have about 8 minutes, and we have like 20 hands and name tags. I'm not going to get to all of you. I'm going to take 3 from each side of the room. So I apologize in advance to all of you. Gentleman with the glasses over there.
Hi, my name is William Young. I'm an analyst at International Crisis Group. I think my question is more kind of like, with competing narratives and competing kind of how do all the panelists view the competing narratives kind of limit the prospect of dialogue, limit the prospect of potential crisis management in a situation where we do see the need to create spaces for that? Because I think when both sides are trying to counter the other side's narratives, oftentimes we tend to see perceptions being hardened on, of the other side, and maybe that also limits the opportunity for engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill?
Hi there. My question is for Hubo. About 10 days ago, 27th of October, the Philippine network GMA published a report that the Philippines Navy had chased away some Chinese fishing boats near Ayungin Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, and that during the incident, it had confiscated plastic bottles containing suspected cyanide chemicals that were used for illegal fishing. And they published a picture of the bottles. Now, this is a common method for illegal fishing. According to the World Wildlife Fund, you take a couple of sodium cyanide tablets, you put them in a washing up bottle, and then you squirt them in the face of the fish. But your organization, the SCS Probing Initiative, retweeted that article and said, the suspected cyanide bottle is a dishwashing liquid well known in China. Now, you hadn't checked that story, so are you an agent of disinformation?
Thank you. Hafiz?
My question is to Dr. Hu as well. So, how can China be a responsible power by showing restraint and increase its confidence towards engaging the ASEAN centrality when this is, what I've been hearing is all about the battle of narrative. It's rather sidelining the other peripheral states. So can you give us some confidence in that? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm moving on to the middle panel with apologies to the right side of the room for me. Aristio, please.
Thank you very much. My question goes to Commodore J. Tariola. Aristio from University of Indonesia. Thanks for sharing the Philippine experience in transparency. So my question is that how do you think this are there any implications from this transparency initiative to the economic relationships between China and the Philippines? Of course, I think this is very important to ensure compliance with international law, but for some Southeast Asian countries, such as Indonesia, I think we are reluctant to do the transparency initiative because we are afraid that it might impact the trade or investment relationship with China. So how does the Philippine experience on this? Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Pham?
Thank you, panelists, for your insight. My name is Phan Pham from the South China Sea Chronicle Initiative based in Vietnam, and I have a question for Dr. Hubo and a comment to Professor Brady's study. So to Dr. Hubo, you mentioned that China is doing everything on the ground just to protect your sovereignty. The Philippines also have its own right, a legitimate right claim, and Vietnam as well. So why doesn't China protect its sovereignty claims at an international court peacefully? Also, that is my questions to Dr. Hubo, and I'd like to have a comment on Professor Brady's study, and I also share your view that Vietnam is quite capable in against China interference, especially on the South China Sea claims. However, recently we are conducting a study on the cognitive warfare, and we have watched hundreds of the short clips from China. So it seems to me that there's a worrying trend that a flood of TikTok short story spread on the social media and can draw thousands or millions viewers with similar message, for example, like the power of the money over the law or the supremacy of China over the West. It's a kind of indirect message, but it may, in the long run, it may weaken the willingness of people to do the right things. Yeah, so thank you very much.
So.
Hello. Yes. Good morning, everybody. I have a question for Dr. Hubo. You mentioned in your presentation that the Philippines should stop giving Beijing chances. And based on your job and your work at the South China Sea Probing Institute at the Peking University, the role of your organization is to promote peace and stability and practical cooperation through studies that you conduct in the South China Sea. And one of the findings of your organization is that the Philippines should stop provoking China because these provocations are leading to tensions. So, given the findings of your organization, my question is, the intention of the Philippines in Scarborough Shoal has always been to support our fishermen. And are you saying, therefore, that we should start supporting our fishermen who go to Scarborough Shoal so that there will be no incidents that will lead to tensions in the West Philippine Sea? That's my first question. My second question is that you mentioned about third-party validation of actions in the West Philippine Sea. And in your presentation, you said even governments can make mistakes. So the premise is the Philippine government makes mistakes, the Chinese government makes mistakes, and when we release information to the public, it cannot be trusted because it is in accordance with the national interest. Therefore, would it be possible, would China agree to third-party validation? Meaning, would you, because we in the Philippines already allow third-party media to board our ships in conducting missions in the West Philippine Sea, would you think the Chinese government would allow third-party media also to board your ships? If you don't like CNN or BBC or Western media, perhaps Singapore media, like CNA, or Malaysian media. Would China be willing to do that? We will allow them in our ships, you will allow them in your ships, and then let them make the discovery to the world in accordance with transparency. Thank you.
Thank you. Natalie and then Professor Kanehara. Natalie first.
Can you hear me?
Professor Kanehara, Natalie first, and then I'll give you the mic. Go ahead, Nat.
It's okay? It's on? Okay. Hello? Okay. My question is to Professor Brady, Dr. Olberg, and also to Dr. Yo. Many of the participants here come from countries with large Chinese communities, and in many states in our region, even in democracies, there's growing resistance to immigrant groups and populist politicians who are exploiting fault lines, particularly against Chinese communities. How do we operationalize national resilience against this backdrop? And more specifically, how do we address infiltration and vulnerability of Chinese communities and diasporas in these states without it descending into being weaponized by domestic political interests and populist coalitions? And how do we stop it becoming a witch hunt or at worst persecution?
Thank you. Professor Kanehara? Is the mic on?
Can you hear?
Yes.
Can you hear?
Yes,
Thank you very much.
please.
Is that okay? After serving as policy advisor to the Japan Coast Guard, now I'm a member of external expert of network for the JCG. My question is regarding the categorization of information. Japan has also instituted MDA. It is not a difficult task to set categorization of information. First, information that should be made public. Second, information that should be shared by only limited number of ministries and also agencies. Third, information that should be shared by solely self-defense forces and Japan Coast Guard. The most difficult task is to categorize certain information to one of these three categories. I'm afraid that no solid resolution has been reached. If I could hear some advice on this issue from any speakers, I would be most grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. And with apologies, I'm going to have to close it there. We're already past time, so apologies to the organizers. Professor Brady, I'm going to start with you. I'd like for all the panelists to just take 90 seconds, if you would. You don't have to respond to every single question.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to respond to Natalie's comment about how to protect the overseas Chinese community. And I know you're from Australia, and Australia was the first country in the world to really look closely at China's foreign interference policies under the Garnaut-ASIO report. And Australia has quite a contentious political environment. Now, New Zealand was about a year or 2 years behind you in dealing with this. And in New Zealand, we looked at the Australian experience and tried to learn from the lessons. And it's not to say that we've done massive improvement, but one of the things that we have done, we haven't politicized the debate on foreign interference, and we have educated our media and our politicians to clearly talk about the difference between the CCP, China, the Chinese people in China, and our New Zealand Chinese community, who have the right to freedom of speech and association and freedom of religion. And to work hard to protect our New Zealand Chinese community, because they are vulnerable. They do not feel safe in New Zealand. And our New Zealand SIS has worked very hard to build bridges with that community and create a feeling of trust that people can talk about the really serious incidences that have occurred of how people are being targeted, being exfiltrated to China just for exercising their normal political rights. So that's what we have done. We've sought to protect that community, to retain our multi-ethnic society, to find a way to protect our people of Chinese descent within the public sector, at the same time as clearly addressing China's foreign interference and where they have targeted individuals in our society. It's not a witch hunt to say, when you have politicians who are clearly acting on behalf of China, to name them and ask them to leave our parliament. So I think we have to understand foreign interference is not acceptable. It's a breach of our sovereignty. We have to protect our democracies. We have to protect our sovereignty. But we particularly, because of the history of racism in our societies against the Chinese diaspora, we've got to make a big effort to make sure that that community is well protected from even more racism and also from the pressure that the CCP puts on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Olberg.
Very briefly to William Yang's question about competing narratives and dialogue, I don't have a perfect answer for you, but I think it's important to keep in mind that you cannot have dialogue for dialogue's sake when it is being done in bad faith. And that, I think, is the challenge, to differentiate between dialogue that's being done in good faith and dialogue that's being done in bad faith, and to distinguish the two. On the Chinese communities, I can really just reiterate what Professor Brady just said and add two small points. First is, one thing I try to do is be clear on language. Don't talk about Chinese interference, Chinese misinformation, Chinese influence, but name the actor, which is the CCP. And the second thing is, what I like to emphasize is, when I talk to people in Germany, is like, whatever you're experiencing, and if somebody is on the receiving end of being harassed, understand that actually overseas Chinese communities are the primary target group, and whatever you're getting, people that are on the enemy list are getting it much worse. So it's really not, it's very often the target group, and that's important to understand. So terminology and understanding that this is a target group that has agency and that you can work with and that you can reach out to. And those are the most important points from my perspective.
Excellent, thank you. Jay?
Thank you. I would like to respond to the question about the question from Indonesia, whether we are experiencing economic coercion, which is one of the tool set of the People's Republic of China in order for them to coerce other state actors to go on their way. Well, the Philippine government has experienced that because of the importation of banana way back in 2012. But right now, under this administration, we have always been mentioning that the South China Sea issue is not the totality of our engagement with the People's Republic of China. And we are also at the same time diversifying our economic and trade investment through economic resiliency. President Marcos has been visiting a lot of countries to encourage other investors and trade partners to invest in the Philippines, knowing for a fact that China would always be using economic coercion. For the second question about the crisis management, how the battle of narrative affect the crisis management between the Philippines and the People's Republic of China. You know, first of all, I wouldn't agree when people say it's just a battle of narrative between the Philippines and the People's Republic of China as to what is happening in the West Philippine Sea. Because it is not just about narrative, it is a fight or a battle between what is factual and what is propaganda. Dr. Trisha mentioned a while ago that in order for us to check on the factual information, we need to partner with media, the civil society, the academic. All of this we have already carried out. We partnered with media, not just our local, but even international. We have allowed them to be boarded on our vessels for them to witness and tell the story to the world firsthand about the Chinese aggression. So it's not a battle of narrative. It's a battle between the lies and the truthful actions that the Chinese government is doing in the West Philippine Sea. Thank you.
Thank you. Trisha?
I think 2025 has been a test of ASEAN's resilience. We keep talking about ASEAN centrality, but when push comes to shove, can we actually stand together? I think we don't have the answer to that yet. The question about economic coercion is a good one because not only do the small nations, so we keep seeing ourselves as relatively small economies, definitely that's the case for Malaysia. The economic coercion is not just coming from China. The reason we have to navigate this narrow path is precisely because economic coercion is also happening from the United States. So how do we make decisions on security and defense when these have direct implications on our trade and investment relationships? And this cuts both ways. I'll just end, I know 90 seconds, to speak again about the Malaysian experience. I think that's a fascinating question about how minority ethnic Chinese population is viewed within our own countries. Malaysian government is highly sensitive to this. We have 25% of the population that is voting, that is of ethnic Chinese descent. I'll just give you an anecdote. Recently there was an incident in Malaysia in which there were Chinese of Malaysian descent, Malaysians of Chinese descent waving the PRC flags, but in fact, this was actually not Malaysian Chinese, but they were Chinese from the PRC. But it was reported in the media as if it was Malaysian Chinese, and they were highly criticized by the rest of the majority Malay population. I won't go down the details of the case, but this just gives you an exact flashpoint as to the difficulties that governments within Southeast Asia must manage with regards to the local relationships. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I hope that there will be more dialogue, but dialogue that is well-intentioned and also trying to meet the same goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. Dr. Hu, I know a lot of questions for you. Please keep it brief.
Okay. First of all, I want to emphasize that South China Sea disputes is very complicated. And we have claimants have complicated and different claims. So we have to be cautious that I think in our lifetime, maybe next generations and next generations, we couldn't say the final resolution of the disputes. But we can manage the situation. And the dialogue definitely is very important. Even this kind of dialogue, China is the target, but I think it's also valuable for exchange information and ideas and points. And also, even between China and the Philippines, in the last 3 years of conflicts, China and the Philippines also use the diplomatic channel to calm down the situation of Sex Thomas Show and Sambila Show. So we should encourage this kind of operations and diplomacy. And as to the China's policy on the South China Sea, I'm always talking that China's policy has never been changed. I think consistent ever since 1990s of Deng Xiaoping's doctrine of sharing disputes. And now I think China's policy also wants to keep in the status quo. So why China is so serious on Philippines is because I think that the Philippines show an intention to occupy new uninhabited features such as Sambila Shoal, Sandy Cay, and also the Philippines interference, the Taiwan questions, I think is the bottom line of China. So that makes the situation much complicated. And as to the publicity, I think actually China's public are not satisfied with our government's policy on the South China Sea. The public thinks that China's operations are too soft. Even we are so powerful, but we are too soft. So my point is that China is always keeping self-restraint. If without China's self-restraint, I think there are no peace and stability of the South China Sea. China values the stability and the peace of the South China Sea and Southeast Asia, I think, very highly. You will see the statements, you will see the leaders' voice and views. I think it's very clear. We want to have the peace and the stability of the South China Sea. We want to keep the status quo, but we couldn't accept the new northeast if any party wants to change China, so for instance, wants to occupy new uninhabited features, I think China has no choice but to respond. So if the publicity, so I don't think that if China publish the information as the Philippines did, as the Philippines does, as to the South China Sea incidents, I think there are no peace between China and the Philippines. I'm very frankly. So my final point is about the disinformation. So we have a different claims, different understanding, and different perspective on the South China Sea, on the specific features. So it's common, it makes sense that we have different ideas on that, we have different interpretations on that. This is not disinformation. The disinformation is that, but we should communicate, we should criticize each other based on truth and facts. Thanks, I should stop here.
Thank you very much. We can have a whole conference on information operations, but I'm sure you'll agree with me that this has been a very full panel that starts us off for the day. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you all for your questions. I apologize I didn't get to all of them, but perhaps we can carry on the conversation as Tricia has suggested. Thank you again.
Thank you, sirs and ma'ams, and to our panelists for a substantive dialogue. Once again, let's give them a round of applause.